All right, let's move on to hyperphosphatemia. Again, you probably do not have this algorithm here, and um, if you want to, let me just say as a tangential statement, if you want, PDF versions of these revised chapters, there's also a chapter on onconephrology now, um, and a chapter on poisonings and that sort of thing. Those are things that let me give credit to June, who's helped with that. So we have a chapter on intoxications, as well as onconephrology. So if you're interested in those, or you want to wait until supposedly I'm going to get done with this publication of the field guide, which supposedly is going to happen, in months' time, then, we can just wait for that. All right. So that's the problem. That's the problem with neuroticism. It's never good enough. Okay, but I truly think we're very close now. Okay, getting all these algorithms in and revised was a lot of work and finally is done. Okay, so let's talk about the diagnostic overview of hyperphosphatemia. We would see certain cases of hyperphosphatemia. You may not have thought of those things because this is fairly uncommon. We'll talk a little bit about the pathophysiology of hyperphosphatemia. It's basically an interaction with the bioassay for a phosphate by these various species. So if I exclude that, then I might, just as you might expect, this should be a common pattern that is recognizable to you. Is a kidney responsible for it or not? Okay. And so when I have severe reductions in GFR, that's a very likely cause of the hyperphosphatemia. Of course, you're very familiar with. We have an assay, a fractional excretion term, which should be familiar to you. In this case, it's a fractional excretion of phosphate. A term that you're not so familiar with would be tubular maximum of phosphate reclamation or transport, standardized to the GFR, right? That's abbreviated TMP GFR. So tubular maximum of phosphate resorption standardized to a GFR. We'll talk about that in more depth, right? These are the ways that I start to discriminate between, for instance, cases of excess supplementation. Those would have high fractional excretion of phosphate, right? The kidney's doing the right thing. Here I'm going to anticipate a somewhat complicated concept. High fractional excretion of phosphate means low tubular maximum for phosphate transport, right? A maximum for phosphate transport tells you that I am able to reclaim this much. I'm maximally able to reclaim this much phosphate standardized to the GFR that is manifest. Okay, so high fractional excretion of phosphate, right? I'm excreting lots of phosphate means my tubular maximum is dampened, right? I want to lower the maximal capacity for phosphate reclamation if I'm trying to excrete a lot of phosphate, right? I want a low TMP GFR if I have a high fractional excretion of phosphate. Those would be my non-renal causes. Renal causes are in these other branches of the tree. Of course, you're very familiar with advanced renal insufficiency. In that case, it's almost irrelevant what your TMP GFR, and your fractional excretion of phosphate is. Why does that make sense? Remember, in very low GFR, you have two major phosphaturic hormones, right? I have PTH and FGF23. So you may see a high fractional excretion of phosphate when your GFR is low, but that's still a renal origin hyperphosphatemia. Just like we've said in prior discussions, what is a determinant of excretion rates? Well, it's my filtered load, right? And then how much am I reclaiming more distally? So I may have a high fractional excretion of phosphate because PTH and FGF23 are suppressing these reclamation transport processes that reclaim phosphate. But if this is very low, right, filtered load is basically the product of the solute times my GFR. right? So if GFR is exceedingly low, I may have hyperphosphatemia, even though I have a high fractional excretion or a low TM for phosphate. Okay. Now, for these middle areas where my GFR is not that low, that's when I'm going to interrogate the system more deeply. I'm going to measure PTH. I'm going to look at my serum calcium, and then I'm going to come up with these variety of diagnoses, some of which might be disorders of FGF23, which we'll go over, that will help us again elucidate physiology. Obviously, it's very unlikely that you'll see some of these conditions, but they it's still worthwhile to know them because they can show up on tests and problem sets and also help explain physiology, right? Which is the most important part of that, or the most important dimension, not the tests or the problem sets. Let's move on to, again, the initial evaluation. I think we've said a couple of these things. It's it renal or non-renal. You're going to look at your GFR, PFOS, TMP, GFR. Okay. Now, keep in mind that in order to interpret the PFOS or the TMP, GFR, you have to do it in the context of hyperphosphatemia, similar to how you would interpret an aldosterone level in the setting of hyperkalemia or a calcium and a PTH, right? It's always contextual. You need that underlying stimulus for the hormonal response and the end organ response, in this case, renal handling of phosphate, in order to interpret the appropriateness of that handling, right? So you got to be hyperphosphatemic. PFOS, I don't think we have to go over it in great detail. It's a familiar formula that mimics your FENA. You just replace the sodiums with phosphate terms, right, in both the numerator and denominator. TMP GFR conceptually deserves some explanation. So let's talk about that. Again, it is basically telling you, let me make a point and then I'll come back here. The units of TMP GFR is going to be milligrams per deciliter. Milligrams per deciliter. And you can predict that because let's look at least the simplified formula for TMP GFR. Okay. The simplified formula in a range of higher fractional excretion of phosphate is simply the product of my serum phosphate and 1 minus my PFOS, right? This is a percentage, right? PFOS, if I take 1 minus my PFOS, it tells me what fraction of my phosphate is not excreted, but is reabsorbed, right? PFOS tells you what fraction of my filtered load is excreted. 1 minus PFOS is what fraction of my filtered load is reabsorbed. So some people even abbreviate this term as TRP, tubular resorption of phosphate. Okay, that's 1 minus my PFOS. I multiply a percentage times a concentration of serum phosphate and then get milligrams per deciliter, right? So the units are milligrams per deciliter. So let's make that make sense as we understand conceptually what a TMP GFR is telling you. What a TMP GFR is telling you is what concentration, maximal concentration of phosphorus can be delivered to my proximal tubule such that I can maximally resorb, or I can resorb all of the phosphate that arrives. So essentially, I have little to no phosphate that is exiting the proximal tubule. There probably is more distal phosphate reabsorption, but what is most, but certainly almost all of phosphate reabsorption happens proximally. And this is essentially interrogating proximal tubular handling. Okay. So again, what maximal phosphate concentration can be delivered to my proximal tubule such that I can reclaim all of it and render the final urine phosphorus free of phosphate, essentially free of phosphate. Okay, that's conceptually what a TMP GFR is. Okay, and so it makes sense then, if I'm hyperphosphatemic, I want to excrete phosphate, and so I want this tubular maximum for phosphate reabsorption to be low in that scenario, right? That would be the normal response to a patient who has hyperphosphatemia. I would want to dial down proximal tubular function. That means my tubular maximum for phosphate transport is suppressed in that scenario. By the way, tubular maximum is a concept that can be applied to the transport of multiple solutes, especially it is utilized in solutes that are reabsorbed in proximal tubule. It's especially utilized to understand renal handling of solutes that don't have secretion, right? So you can use tubular maximum to describe bicarbonate reclamation. You can argue that we do have some distal bicarbonate secretion through pendrin transporters, but not in most people. Most of us have essentially rendered our bicarbonate free, our urine free of bicarbonate. But you can describe TM bicarbonate. You can also describe glucose in terms of TM glucose, tubular maximum for glucose transport. And some people have reported the biologic effect of SGLT2 inhibitors in terms of what happens to the tubular maximum of glucose transport when you give dapagliflozin, for instance. You can find papers that describe that integrated physiology by utilizing a physiologic term that is a tubular maximum. Okay, in that case, glucose transport. So this is the application of, again, a terminology that exists in integrated physiology. There's nothing, mystic about tubular maximum. Okay. All right. So there we go. You can see that there can be a lot of complexity to calculating the tubular maximum. And this describes the less predictable effect that happens in a portion of the curve for phosphate handling. Let's call it the gray zone, okay? When I have, let's look at it intuitively, high phosphate excretion, I guess I'll call it rates, even though PFOS is not a rate term, it's a percentage. But when I have, let's say, robust phosphate excretion, my tubular maximum can easily be calculated. When I have some kind of reabsorption of phosphate in these lower ranges of PFOS, the way that you try to utilize that clinical information, serum phosphate, PFOS, remember, just needs urine creatinine, serum phos, urine phos, right? So you can see that you need the same terms that you calculate a PFOS are utilized to calculate your TMP GFR, right? You don't need additional data. You just need to think about it differently, right? This describes some of that, let's say, smear of phosphate handling that happens when you are reclaiming some proportion of the filtered phosphate, okay? Is that fair? Okay, this is a nonlinear part of the curve, fractional excretion of the phosphate excretion rate, okay? Nonlinear part of the curve. All right, so by and large, you're in these upper ranges where you can use the simplified formula. Okay, renal causes of hyperphosphatemia. We'd be expected to have inappropriately low fractional excretions of phosphate. Okay, that would be a state in which you might attribute the hyperphosphatemia to a renal cause, right? But keep in mind that you have to think somewhat contextually about the phosphate or the PFOS. Remember, when my GFR is low, you have very early on in CKD increases in FGF23, which we don't measure very often, but you'll have pretty marked and early increased elevations in FGF23. If you understand that, you would predict that when you have some mild CKD, you will tend to have higher PFOSs at baseline, right? And so if you have a CKD patient who has a PFOS of 35% and is hyperphosphatemic, you should be thinking, that's not quite right? Because patients that, or let's say 25%, I'll get to the 25% side of this, right? That's the gray zone. Less than 20%, I would be thinking of a a renal cause of hyperphosphatemia. If I'm seeing, again, PFOS that is 35%, right, I would expect to be even higher when I develop CKD, and so I'll use a different cutoff for patients who have chronic renal insufficiency. And then we've gone over the fact that with severe renal insufficiency, you're going to tend to have very high PFOSs at baseline, and so that's less interpretable, right? We are generally going to still say, well, this is all just a problem of reduced filtered load. And so the kidney is a major responsible party in this hyperphosphatemic state. Okay. TMP GFR that is inappropriately high, right? That tells you the proximal tubule is trying to reclaim inappropriately phosphate, right? A high TM means I am trying to reclaim more phosphate, right? That is suggestive of impaired renal clearance of phosphate. And so again, renal cause of hyperphosphatemia might be in your differential diagnosis in that scenario. As for the non-renal causes of hyperphosphatemia, we're going to want to see high PFOSs. We're going to want to see low TMP GFRs. Okay, that would be scenarios like increased intake, or when I've liberated phosphate from the intracellular space through, for instance, tumor lysis or rhabdomyolysis. Okay. Questions about that overview before we dive into specific syndromes? Okay, let's then do pseudohyperphosphatemia. The pathophysiology, again, is a phenomenon in which there's a interference with the bioassay. Essentially, this set of conditions, hyperlipidemia, certain severe paraproteinemias, amphotericin B, liposomal amphotericin B, they interfere with this reaction that is utilized to quantify phosphate concentrations through a color change, right? This phosphomolybdate changes color when it has phosphate bound to it, right? And so the lab utilizes that color change in order to back calculate how much phosphate was present in the specimen. So when I have these other species in that tube, then this reaction is altered. Okay. Now, just as an aside, we have phosphate that exists in multiple forms, right? Phosphorus refers to elemental phosphorus, right, from the periodic table. But when we use the term phosphate, that is phosphorus with those, those oxygens that are bound to it, right? That's phosphate. Inorganic phosphate refers to that phosphate with the oxygen molecules bound, right? So the PO4, right? HPO4 would be one form of phosphate that can circulate. H2PO4 is another, right? Those are the predominant forms of inorganic phosphate that are circulating. Okay, but phosphorus can be N-phosphate can be found in other places, right, and other forms, right? It can be bound to nucleic acids, right? It can be part of ATP, right? And it can be in the bone, right, as hydroxyapatite. So those are the variety of forms of phosphate that are phosphorus that exist in the body. When we're measuring phosphorus, we're measuring basically, we're inorganic phosphate. We're not measuring the ATP that's in circulation. We're not measuring the phosphate that is bound to nucleic acids or proteins, right, that are phosphorylated. Okay, so we express the phosphate as a mass of elemental phosphorus, though. Okay, we're using so you would use the molecular weight of phosphorus, not phosphate, to interchange between the two. Okay. All right, so let's move on to there's also a scenario in which you might have hemolysis in the tube where intracellular phosphate is also inappropriately, ECF phosphate is inappropriately assumed to be higher than it is. In this case, it's ex vivo hemolysis that has occurred, releasing phosphate into the sample tube for measurement. Okay, moving on. Hyperphosphatemia from impaired renal phosphate excretion is where we're starting. We've talked about the advanced renal insufficiency at length. I don't think we have to talk in depth about this, something that you've sort of you're steeped in, I guess I'll say. What are the things that I need to say about this? I'll just highlight that we often are jumping to phosphate binders in managing hyperphosphatemia. You really need to be focused on diet. Phosphate binders have plenty of downsides, and for instance, calcium-based phosphate binders in particular are associated with vascular calcification. They're costly, and nobody's shown that giving phosphate binders saves lives. It corrects labs, but it doesn't save lives. So I just emphasize again that low phosphorus diet should be really part of how you manage this in a patient with advanced CKD, if you care about the hyperphosphatemia. You can also make the argument that let's just focus on the other things in the care in the care of this patient and not really worry too much about the renal osteodystrophy bullet in my problem list. Okay. All right. Let's go through maybe one or two additional items. Yeah, let's do that. Hypoparathyroidism, because again, PTH is a phosphaturic hormone, would be predictably associated with, again, hyperphosphatemia from impaired renal phosphate excretion. I would see, as expected, low PFOS, right? Remember, TM is the inverse of that, high TMP GFR, right? That would be indicative of impaired renal clearance of phosphate. So if I have low PTH, these scenarios would also be associated with low serum calcium, right? So they're here. I'm looking at low PTH and low calcium, right? This would be the primary hypoparathyroidism, right? And there's a variety of, looks like, yeah, see, this is another, problem here. I didn't close my parentheses. See, these are the things that are bogging me down. Okay, so post-surgical hypoparathyroidism, infiltrative diseases, hyper and hypomagnesemia can be associated with low PTH. We've talked about the fact that sometimes PTHs are high with hypomagnesemia in particular, because I have a peripheral resistance to PTH, right? There's genetic causes of low PTH. We talked about the autosomal dominant hypocalcemia in our discussion of vitamin D receptor. I'm sorry, calcium sensing receptor biology. We went through FHH and autosomal dominant hypocalcemia, right? So these are the things that we're going to cover, right? So hypoparathyroidism can include a variety of different causes. We've gone over some of that, autoimmune being one of them. We talked about these conditions as we discussed hypocalcemia. We've gone over the magnesium disorders already. I won't belabor the autosomal dominant hypocalcemia, except to just remind you that this is an activating mutation of a calcium sensing receptor, right? The inverse of the biology of FHH. Calcimimetic use is another kind of form of this. You would have to overdose in order to have a suppressed PTH. The most common pattern that we're going to see with calcimimetics is going to be like a lower than historic values of PTH and then low calcium. So you'd have to really be aggressive with dosing calcimimetics to manifest a hypoparathyroidism with hypocalcemia, right? That's right. So I've just said this, PTH that's lower than historic values, although it may not be overtly low. And let's do one last section here. Conditions with low PTH and high calcium, right? So low PTH and high calcium would have the syndromes in which I might have excess vitamin D, right? So how is this playing out? If I have excess vitamin D causing hypercalcemia, the hypercalcemia stimulates or engages the calcium sensing receptor, suppressing PTH, right? In addition, vitamin D excess will increase the absorption of not only calcium, but phosphorus from the gut. So those would be the two main mechanisms whereby a patient may manifest hyperphosphatemia, right? Reduced phosphate wasting by suppression of PTH and increased absorption of phosphorus from the gut. There can be overdosing of vitamin D, granulomatous diseases. We went over this disorder of vitamin D inactivation, the 24 hydroxylase deficiency, right? We went over that as we discussed hypercalcemia. Immobilization would be another scenario in which calcium may be elevated, PTH would be suppressed. The immobilized bone, as it's demineralizing, will also liberate phosphate, right? And so, again, there'll be more than one mechanism at play in causing the hyperphosphatemia. Thyrotoxicosis, you know, increased osteoclast activity resulting in hypercalcemia and suppression of PTH, and these others, which we talked about in our discussion around hypercalcemia. Okay, so those would be the words that are presented here. A summary is provided in that figure. Okay, questions? We talked about the pathophysiology as well. Suppression of PTH and increased in enteral absorption of phosphate. We can end there if there are no other questions.